She'll never leave me, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood said, because kings often mistake silence for surrender. The royal study was warm that night, sealed against winter by thick curtains, a dying fire, and the kind of power that made men speak carelessly when they believed the right people were listening. Lucas Reed stood near the map table with a border report in his hand. Vanessa Hart sat by the hearth in pale blue silk, her fingers resting around an untouched cup of wine. And outside the half-open door, Clara Miller stood with the crisis report Ethan had requested before midnight. She had walked these corridors too many times to make noise. That had once been useful. Tonight, it made the truth easier to hear. "You are too certain," Lucas said quietly. "Clara has carried more than anyone admits." Ethan did not look up from the treaty draft spread before him. "Clara is angry." Vanessa's gaze lifted. "Because of me?" Ethan paused, but not long enough to suggest guilt. "Because of change." Clara's fingers tightened around the report. Change. A clean word. A royal word. The kind of word people used when they wanted a wound to sound like policy. Lucas's voice hardened slightly. "She is not a piece of furniture to be moved when the room changes." Ethan finally looked at him. "Do not dramatize this." "I am not." Lucas lowered the report. "I am warning you." Vanessa turned toward Ethan, her expression soft in the careful way women used when they wanted sympathy without appearing to ask for it. "How can you be so sure she will stay?" Ethan gave a short, tired breath, almost a laugh. "Because she always stays." The sentence entered the corridor and stopped Clara's heart without making any sound. There it was. Not love, not faith, not gratitude. Habit. He did not believe she would remain because he cherished her. He believed she would remain because she had taught him, year after year, that she could survive being unchosen. Lucas said nothing. That silence was its own confession. Ethan continued, colder now, more confident because no one had contradicted him quickly enough. "She knows where she belongs." Clara looked down at the crisis report in her hands. It contained 3 border names, 1 urgent supply failure, and a warning about the royal wolves refusing medicine unless she came before dawn. Things Ethan would need. Things the palace would look for her to solve. Things that had always pulled her back, even when pride told her not to return. She stepped closer to the small table beside the study door and placed the report there with careful hands. Not thrown, not torn, delivered, as always. Then she reached beneath her cloak and touched the moonstone clasp at her throat. Ethan had fastened it there 2 winters ago after she kept the Western Treaty from collapsing. He had said, "I would lose half this kingdom without you." Clara had heard devotion in that sentence. Tonight, she understood it had only been accuracy. He would lose things without her. That did not mean he had ever feared losing her. Inside the study, Vanessa asked softly, "And if she does leave?" Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "She won't." Clara unclasped the moonstone. The cold hit the bare skin of her throat first. Then clarity. It did not arrive like anger. Anger would have wanted to enter the room. Clarity only wanted a door. She placed the clasp on top of the crisis report. The stone glowed once, faint and blue, then went dark. Lucas must have heard the soft click of silver against paper because his head turned toward the door. Clara had already stepped back. For one brief second, she saw him through the narrow opening. He saw her too. His face changed. Warning. Regret. Too late. Clara lifted one finger to her lips. Not for secrecy. For silence. The kind she chose now, not the kind they had used from her. Then she turned away. Behind her, Ethan Blackwood was still speaking in the warm room, where he believed certainty could keep a woman in place. Clara walked down the dark corridor without a tear, without a scene, without waiting to hear whether he would say her name. The doorway behind her remained empty. It would take him longer than it should have to turn around and notice. The corridor outside the royal study did not echo when Clara Miller walked away. It should have. Blackwood Palace was built to echo power, footsteps, commands, verdicts, but it had never learned how to echo absence. Clara moved through it like someone who had spent years memorizing where sound might betray her. Tonight, she did not care if it did. Behind the half-open door, Ethan Blackwood was still speaking. "She is angry," he said calmly, as if naming weather. "She will calm down." Vanessa Hart's voice followed gently. "And if she does not?" There was a pause, small and confident. "She will." Lucas Reed shifted near the map table. "You are describing her like a cycle, not a person." Ethan did not like that sentence. Clara could hear it in the way the air tightened. Clara Miller understands where she belongs, Ethan said, final enough to end the discussion. That was the second blade. Not the rejection of her presence, but the assumption that she had never learned the shape of choice. Clara stopped once at the end of the corridor, not because she doubted herself, because memory insisted on one last argument. I do not know what I would do without you. She had mistaken it for irreplaceable love. Now she understood something more precise. He had meant operational dependency, nothing more. She continued walking. The palace servants did not stop her. That was the strange part. When someone important leaves a place that believes it owns them, the world usually reacts. Guards question. Doors close. Voices call names. Tonight, the palace hesitated, as if it had not yet received permission to notice. Clara reached her chamber without being followed. The door opened with a soft click she had always associated with return, not departure. Inside, everything looked exactly as it should for someone who was expected to come back. Neat desk. Folded cloak. Council reports stacked in careful order. The illusion of continuity. Clara placed her crisis report on the bed. Then she began to remove what the palace had mistaken for permanence. Not dramatically, not angrily, carefully. The moonstone clasp came off first, leaving a cold line against her skin where obligation had rested for years. She set it on the desk, not as a rejection of beauty, but as a correction of meaning. Next came the palace key, then the wolf medicine ledger, then the advisory seal stamped with her name that had never been officially recorded in council minutes. Each object landed with a quiet finality that did not feel like destruction. It felt like alignment. Outside her door, she heard footsteps once. Maggie Collins. They stopped. No knock followed. A shared understanding passed through the wall without language. If Clara opened this door now, she would stay in a world that called her return inevitable. If she did not, she would become something else entirely. Clara did not open it. Instead, she wrote a single line on the back of the crisis report. Not an apology, not a warning, just structure. I will not be where I am assumed. She left the paper on the bed where it would be found too late to argue with. When she finally stepped into the servants' passage, the palace behind her was still convinced she was inside it. That belief would last until morning. And when Ethan Blackwood turned and looked for her voice again, he would find only silence that had already learned how to leave. Clara had not planned to leave that night. That was important, though she knew no one in Blackwood Palace would understand it. They would call it impulsive because it happened quickly. They would call it emotional because it came after pain. They would call it dramatic because people who had ignored quiet suffering always mistook quiet escape for drama. But Clara knew the truth. Leaving had not begun in the corridor outside Ethan's study. It had begun in smaller rooms, over smaller wounds, across years no one had counted because she had survived them without making the palace uncomfortable. It had begun the first time a council elder handed her a treaty draft and said, "Make it readable before the king sees it," then praised Ethan the next morning for his clarity. It had begun the first time the royal wolves refused medicine from 3 healers but lowered their heads when Clara entered, and Ethan said, "You have a gift for calming things," as if her usefulness were a charming habit instead of labor. It had begun when Vanessa Hart returned to court and servants started setting an extra cup near the royal study, while Clara's chair moved closer to the wall. She had noticed. Of course she had noticed. Women who are taken for granted notice everything. They notice the pause before their names, the shift in seating, the way gratitude becomes shorter when it has been given too often, the way men say, "I need you," only when something is already breaking. In her chamber, Clara changed out of the dark blue dress Ethan preferred for council nights and put on the plain gray traveling gown she had not worn in years. It fit too closely at the shoulders and too loosely at the waist. A dress from another life. A life before palace corridors learned her footsteps. She folded only 2 garments into a small leather bag. Her mother's ring, a comb, 3 coins, a wrapped piece of dried lavender Maggie had once tucked into her drawer after a fever. That was all. 5 years in Blackwood Palace, and what truly belonged to her could fit beneath one arm. The realization did not break her. It clarified the inventory. On the desk, the returned objects formed a quiet map of everything the palace had borrowed and renamed devotion. The moonstone clasp, the palace key, the wolf medicine ledger, the advisory seal. the emergency grain routes, the list of servants whose families needed winter coal. She added one more thing. The small black ribbon Ethan had once tied around her wrist after a Northern Treaty dinner, laughing softly because the council had finally called her valuable. He had said, "See? They are learning." Clara had smiled then, foolishly warmed by the idea that being noticed might become being chosen. Now she placed the ribbon beside the clasp. No bitterness, only accuracy. They had learned her value. They had never learned her worth. A soft knock touched the door, not firm enough to be Lucas, not careless enough to be a guard. Maggie. Clara stood very still. The knock did not come again. Maggie knew better than to force a threshold. After a moment, Clara opened the door. Maggie Collins stood in the corridor with a shawl around her shoulders, face pale, eyes already wet. She looked at the bag in Clara's hand, then at the bare place on Clara's throat, then at the desk behind her. Understanding moved through her before words did. "You heard him," Maggie whispered. Clara did not ask how she knew. The palace had many walls, and women who served behind them heard more truth than kings intended. "Yes." Maggie swallowed. "All of it." Clara's mouth moved almost into a smile. Not the kind meant to reassure. The kind that spared them both from pretending. "Enough." Maggie's hand covered her mouth for 1 second. Then it fell. "Should I wake him?" The question was old habit, not advice. Everything in Blackwood was brought to Ethan eventually. Crisis. Grief. Wolves. Weather. Women. Clara looked past Maggie toward the dim servants' passage at the end of the hall. No, Maggie's tears finally slipped, silent and furious. "He will say you should have spoken to him. He was speaking clearly enough without me." Maggie closed her eyes. That hurt her. Good. Some truths deserved witnesses who loved you enough not to soften them. Clara stepped into the corridor and closed her chamber door behind her. Not loudly. Never loudly. The sound was small, almost polite. That made it final. "Do not tell him until morning," Clara said. Maggie shook her head. "He will blame me." No, Clara's voice remained calm. "He will blame everyone before he understands himself." Maggie let out a broken breath that might have been agreement. "Where will you go?" Clara looked down the corridor, toward the servant stairs, toward the old gate behind the laundry wing, toward the road she had never taken because staying had once felt like proof of love. Somewhere his certainty cannot follow quickly. Maggie reached into her shawl and pulled out a brass service token. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it into Clara's palm. The laundry gate. Push twice. The hinge sticks. Clara looked at the token, then at Maggie. "You kept this ready." Maggie's face crumpled. "I hoped you would never need it." Clara closed her fingers around the brass. "That is different from hoping I would never leave." Maggie nodded, crying harder now because she understood the mercy and the accusation inside the sentence. Clara touched her shoulder once. Briefly, carefully. "Thank you. What should I tell him when he asks?" Maggie whispered. Clara glanced back at the closed door, at the chamber that would soon look too clean for panic and too empty for denial. "Tell him the doorway was empty before he turned around." Maggie stared at her. Clara's expression did not change. "He will understand later." Then she walked toward the servants' stairs with her small bag in hand, the brass token warm against her palm, and the cold clarity of a woman who had finally realized that being expected to stay was not the same as being wanted. The servants' passage beneath Blackwood Palace was never meant for endings. It was meant for supply carts, whispered conversations, and women who were told not to matter in the places they kept alive. Clara Miller walked through it slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she was finally unlearning urgency. Behind her, the palace still believed in continuity. That belief had not yet cracked. Above her, in the royal study, Ethan Blackwood remained inside a sentence that had not yet caught up with reality. "She will come back," he said, voice steady, almost bored with certainty. "She is angry, not gone." Lucas Reed did not answer immediately this time. That hesitation was new. Vanessa Hart stood from the hearth. "And if you are wrong?" Ethan's eyes did not lift from the map table. "I am not wrong about Clara." That was the problem. He had never learned the difference between being correct and being left behind. Clara reached the servants' stairwell door. It was narrow, old wood, slightly warped from years of use. The brass token Maggie had given her felt warm in her palm, like it remembered every woman who had ever needed it. She paused, not because she wanted to return, because memory tried, one last time, to negotiate. 5 years ago, Ethan had found her in a storm room after a border collapse, hands stained with ink and blood, refusing to sleep. "I do not know what I would do without you," he had said then. She had believed it meant she was irreplaceable. Now she understood it meant she was available. Clara pushed the door open. The stairwell was colder than the palace above it. Not emotionally colder, structurally colder. This was the temperature of places that did not expect to be chosen. Each step downward was quiet, but not secret. She was not hiding. She was exiting. At the third landing, she heard footsteps above. Quick. Controlled. Lucas. He had come too late to stop her, but early enough to understand what he was seeing. "Clara," he called softly. She stopped, but did not turn fully. Lucas stood at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing. His face had lost its usual precision. "You don't have to do this like this." Clara looked up at him. Not angry, not pleading, just present. "There is no other way that would be respected," she said. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Lucas swallowed. "He will think you are punishing him." "I am not thinking about what he will think." For the first time, Lucas had no prepared response. Clara adjusted the strap of her small bag on her shoulder. "Tell him what you want. It will not change the outcome." "That sounds final." "It is not final," she said quietly. "It is accurate." She continued down. Behind her, Lucas spoke again, lower now. "He said you know where you belong." Clara stopped on the last step before the lower door. This time, she turned fully. Her voice was calm enough to feel like distance. "That is what makes it possible." Then she stepped through the lower exit. Outside, the servants' yard was still dark, frost collecting along the edges of stone barrels and supply carts. The world here did not ask for permission to continue. She crossed it without hesitation. Above, the palace still had not realized she had completed leaving. It was still arguing with itself inside warm rooms, still calling her return inevitable, still mistaking absence for pause. In the royal study, Ethan Blackwood finally moved. He turned his head toward the doorway and saw it. Empty. Not slightly empty. Not temporarily empty. Empty in the way that meant something had already finished happening elsewhere. The sentence he had spoken a moment ago collapsed inside the silence that followed it. "She will come back." But the doorway did not answer. It never would again. The laundry gate opened on the second push, exactly as Maggie had promised. Its old hinge resisted for one breath, then yielded with a low metal groan that seemed too loud in the sleeping yard. Clara paused with one hand against the frozen wood. No alarm sounded. No guard shouted. No royal command cracked through the dark. For years, she had believed leaving Blackwood Palace would require a battle. In the end, all it required was a brass token, a servant's memory, and the willingness to stop asking a man to understand what he had already chosen not to see. The outer yard stretched before her in shades of gray. Snow had fallen earlier, thin and dry, enough to soften the stone paths without hiding them. Clara stepped out carefully. Her plain traveling gown moved around her ankles. Her small bag rested against her hip. Her throat felt strangely light without the moonstone clasp. Cold touched the bare place where Ethan's gift had been, and she welcomed it. At least the cold did not pretend to be devotion. Near the kennels, something shifted. Clara stopped. The royal wolves were awake. One by one, shadows rose behind the iron fencing. Large bodies, silver eyes, quiet breath curling white in the air. They had never treated Clara as unimportant. Wolves did not flatter. Wolves did not hold court. Wolves did not call labor loyalty and loyalty inevitability. The oldest wolf, a scarred gray female named Rowan, came to the fence and lowered her head. Clara's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. "I cannot come to the medicine den tonight," she whispered. Rowan's ears moved. Behind her, the younger wolves stood silent, watching the woman who had cleaned their wounds, mixed their fever drafts, sat beside them through silver sickness, and never once asked the palace to call it power. Clara stepped closer to the fence. Her fingers slipped between the cold bars. Rowan pressed her muzzle against them. The contact broke something small and tender inside Clara, but not enough to turn her back. "You will eat for Lucas," she said softly. "He knows the mixture now? Not as well as I do, but enough." Rowan made a low sound that was not agreement. Clara smiled faintly. "Do not make this harder." The wolf did not move. For a moment, the servants' yard, the palace, the study, Ethan's certainty, Vanessa's softness, Lucas's warning, all of it seemed very far away. There was only the fence, the snow, and the animals that had recognized her care before people gave it a name. "I stayed too long," Clara said. Her voice did not tremble. That surprised her. "Not for you. Never for you." Rowan's eyes held hers. Clara understood the difference, and maybe the wolf did too. She had stayed for those who needed gentleness. For frightened maids. For feverish pups. For treaties that would spare border villages. For the younger version of herself who once believed endurance could become love if it was patient enough. But she had not stayed because Ethan Blackwood owned her. Not then. Not now. A distant door slammed somewhere inside the palace. Clara turned her head. The sound was faint, but it carried urgency. Someone had noticed something. The empty doorway, perhaps. The report outside the study. The moonstone clasp gone from her throat. Time, which had moved slowly all night, suddenly remembered how to run. Clara withdrew her hand from the fence. Rowan pushed once against the bars, restless and silent. "No," Clara whispered. "Do not follow." The command was gentle. The wolf hated it, but obeyed. Clara stepped away. Across the yard, the old service road curved toward the lower woods. Beyond that road was the northern path, and beyond that, if she kept walking, a world where Ethan's certainty would have to travel slower than her choice. She reached the gate arch just as a voice behind her called her name. Not Ethan. Lucas. Clara. She stopped beneath the stone arch, snow dusting her hair. Lucas stood at the far end of the yard, coat half-fastened, breath uneven. His face was pale with the knowledge of a man who had seen the shape of disaster and knew it had already happened. He turned around. "Lucas," said. Clara did not ask who. "And?" Lucas looked toward the palace, then back at her. The doorway was empty. Clara absorbed that quietly. No triumph came. No pleasure. Only the strange, clean ache of being proven gone. Lucas took one careful step forward. "He is going to come after you." Clara looked past him, toward the high black windows of the royal study. A figure moved behind one of them. Too distant to read. Too late to matter. Then tell him not to wake the palace for a woman he believed would never leave. Lucas closed his eyes. When he opened them, regret stood in them like a confession he had no right to make for another man. "Where will you go?" Clara turned toward the service road. The snow before her was unmarked. For the first time in years, no one had assigned her next task. "Forward," she said. Then she walked through the laundry gate into the cold hour before dawn, leaving behind the wolves, the palace, and the man who had mistaken her silence for a promise. Clara Miller did not stop walking when the palace finally realized she was gone. That was the difference between leaving and being chased. One belonged to emotion. The other belonged to timing. And Clara had finally learned timing from the very man who had never learned to respect it. Behind her, Blackwood Palace began to wake in fragments. Not all at once. First, a servant noticed the crisis report still resting outside the royal study door. Then another realized the moonstone clasp was missing from the table where it always caught candlelight. Then Lucas Reed opened the study door fully and saw what Ethan Blackwood had not yet turned around to understand. An empty doorway. Not empty like absence after someone steps away. Empty like something essential had been removed and the world had not yet updated itself. Inside the room, Ethan was still standing. "She is overreacting," he said, voice controlled, almost dismissive now that the conversation had moved beyond his attention span. "Clara will return after she calms down." Vanessa Hart did not speak this time. Lucas did. "No," he said quietly. That single word did not belong in Blackwood Palace. It had never been used toward Ethan without consequence. Ethan finally looked up. Lucas continued, slower now, as if speaking required breaking something internal. "She is not in the palace." A pause. Then Ethan frowned, like the sentence itself was incorrect. "She is in her chamber." Lucas shook his head once. That was when Ethan moved. Not urgently. Not panicked. Not yet. He walked first. Because kings rarely believe absence until they physically encounter it. The corridor to Clara's chamber was too quiet. Servants stood frozen in doorways as words spread without being spoken. A palace did not need alarms when something fundamental changed. It simply stopped behaving normally. Ethan reached Clara's door, opened it, stopped. The room was too clean. Not messy like escape. Not disturbed like conflict. Clean like completion. The bed was made. The desk was cleared. The chair was pushed in. And on the surface of that chair, objects arranged with careful intention, was everything that had once anchored Clara Miller to Blackwood Palace. The moonstone clasp, the palace key, the wolf medicine ledger, the advisory seal, and beneath them, a single folded report. Ethan did not move for several seconds. Lucas arrived behind him. Vanessa stayed in the corridor, suddenly understanding that whatever this was, it did not belong to observation. Ethan stepped forward slowly. He picked up the moonstone clasp first. It was cold, not because of the stone, because it had stopped being worn. His fingers tightened around it instinctively, as if pressure could reverse what he was seeing. "This is unnecessary," he said, but his voice had shifted slightly now. Less certainty, more confusion trying to rebuild itself. Lucas answered softly. "She returned everything." Ethan looked at him sharply. "That does not mean she has left." But even as he said it, he understood the weakness in the logic. He turned toward the bed, picked up the folded report. Clara's handwriting was precise. Not emotional, not rushed, just final. Ethan unfolded it. Read once, then again. The words were simple enough that they did not need interpretation. "I will not be where I am assumed." Silence expanded in the room. It was not dramatic silence. It was structural silence. The kind that happens when something a system depended on stops participating in the system. Ethan lowered the paper slightly. "That is a statement," he said. Lucas did not respond immediately. Then, carefully, "It is a departure." Ethan shook his head once, as if rejecting the classification. "She will return." But the sentence sounded different now. Less like truth, more like habit refusing to die. Outside the palace window, dawn began to rise over Blackwood lands. Light touched the towers first, then the courtyard, then the empty pathways Clara had crossed hours earlier without leaving footprints for anyone to follow properly. Ethan stepped back into the corridor, looked down it. For the first time, he noticed something he had never trained himself to see. Not her presence, her absence. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply existed where certainty had once been. And somewhere beyond the palace gates, Clara Miller continued forward without looking back, carrying nothing that belonged to Blackwood and everything that finally belonged to her. Ethan Blackwood did not run at first. That would come later, after pride had exhausted every slower explanation. At dawn, he stood in Clara Miller's empty chamber with the moonstone clasp in his hand and tried to command the absence into meaning something smaller. A quarrel, a lesson, a brief rebellion. A woman finally tired enough to make him look. Anything except what it was. Lucas Reed watched from the doorway, his face pale with the restraint of a man who had warned too softly and too late. "Send riders," Ethan said. Lucas did not move. Ethan turned. "That was not a suggestion." "No," Lucas said. The word was quiet. It was also impossible to ignore. Ethan's eyes sharpened. "Careful." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I am being careful. That is why I am telling you not to turn her departure into a haunt." The room went colder than the morning. Vanessa Hart stood farther down the corridor, wrapped in a pale robe, suddenly less certain of her place near the king. Servants pretended not to listen. Everyone listened. Ethan closed his hand around the clasp until the silver edges pressed into his palm. "She left Blackwood territory without permission." "She left your assumption," Lucas said. "Those are not the same thing." Ethan stepped toward him. Power moved with him, old and instinctive. The kind of power that made lesser men lower their eyes. Lucas did not lower his. Perhaps guilt had made him brave. Perhaps Clara's absence had. "She is mine to protect," Ethan said. Lucas's face shifted, almost painfully. "You cannot protect someone from the wound you are defending." For a moment, Ethan looked as if he might strike the sentence instead of the man. Then something below the palace interrupted them. A sound rose from the kennels. Low, many voices. The royal wolves were awake. Not howling, not mourning. Warning. Ethan turned toward the window. In the courtyard below, the wolves stood in a line behind the iron fencing, bodies still, silver eyes fixed on the northern road. Rowan, the oldest gray female, pressed her scarred muzzle against the bars and refused the bowl placed before her. A kennel master tried to approach. She showed teeth. Ethan's throat tightened before he could name why. "They will not eat," Lucas said. "They are waiting for Clara." Ethan looked down at the clasp in his palm. Suddenly, the object felt less like a returned gift and more like evidence. "Prepare my horse," he said. Lucas exhaled. "Ethan, now." This time, Lucas did move. Not because he agreed. Because the damage was already choosing its direction. Ethan left Clara's chamber without looking again at the clean bed, the clear desk, the folded report. Looking had begun to feel like surrender. He reached the lower yard as the first pale edge of sun broke over the roofs. Servants stepped out of his path, but not with the usual fear. Something had changed in their faces. They were not defying him. That would have been simpler. They were measuring him against what was missing. Maggie Collins stood near the laundry gate, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were red, but her spine was straight. Ethan stopped before her. You saw her. Maggie did not lie. Yes. And you let her pass. She was not a prisoner. The words landed publicly. Several servants looked down, not in shame for Maggie, in fear for her. Ethan stared at the old gate behind her. The hinge still stood slightly open, snow gathered around the base. Where did she go? Maggie's mouth trembled once, then steadied. Forward. Ethan's expression hardened. Do not be poetic with me. I am not, Maggie said. That is what she said. Silence moved through the yard like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Ethan stepped closer. You should have woken me. Maggie lifted her chin. She told me not to wake a man who was sleeping inside the certainty he chose. Lucas, arriving behind Ethan with a cloak and riding gloves, went very still. Ethan did not speak. For one terrible second, even the wolves stopped making sound. Then Rowan struck the iron fence once with her shoulder. Not violently. Decisively. Ethan looked toward her. The wolf did not bow. That hurt in a place no council had ever reached. Open the gate, Ethan said. The guards hesitated. Not because they refused, but because everyone understood that the gate he meant had already failed to hold what mattered. Maggie stepped aside. The laundry gate opened wider with the same low groan it had given Clara. Ethan mounted without another word. Lucas rode behind him. They followed the service road into the waking snow, past the place where Clara's footprints had already begun to fade under new frost. For the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood was not moving ahead of her. He was following a woman he had believed would never require pursuit. And every hoofbeat seemed to repeat the sentence he had spoken too easily. She'll never leave me. She'll never leave me. She'll never leave me. Until the road answered with nothing at all. Clara Miller did not stop at the edge of Blackwood territory because she was afraid of what lay beyond it. She stopped only once, when the road narrowed into a line of frost-covered stone and the world behind her became something she could no longer pretend was temporary. Behind her, the kingdom was already waking into consequence. Ahead of her, nothing had yet decided her name. She adjusted the strap of her small bag and continued forward. No one followed immediately. That fact alone would have surprised Ethan Blackwood if he had been capable of understanding it in real time. Kings are trained to expect pursuit, resistance, correction. They are not trained for absence that refuses to behave like absence. By the time Ethan reached the outer ridge with Lucas Reed beside him, the morning wind had sharpened into something almost cruel. The land below stretched empty, pale, and indifferent. Tracks end here, Lucas said. Ethan dismounted before the horse fully stopped. Snow crushed beneath his boots as he moved forward, scanning the road as if it might confess where she had gone. But the road did not confess. It simply continued forward without her. That is impossible, Ethan said. Lucas did not respond. Because nothing about it was impossible. It was only unfamiliar. A rider from the Northern Patrol approached behind them, breath visible in quick bursts. Alpha King, he said, hesitant. No sign of movement beyond the old border trail. No guards engaged. No. Then search harder, Ethan cut in. The rider hesitated. There is something else. Ethan turned sharply. Speak. The wolves did not follow the scent trail. That sentence changed the air. Lucas looked down first. Ethan's expression did not break, but something behind it tightened. That makes no sense, Ethan said. But even as he said it, he understood the implication forming underneath it. Royal wolves did not ignore scent unless they refused to acknowledge ownership, or unless ownership no longer existed. Back at the palace, things were already misaligning. Servants reported that Clara's chambers remained untouched. The council archive could not locate half the morning's scheduled briefings. 2 border messengers returned without knowing whom to deliver reports to. Even the palace hounds refused feeding routes that Clara normally oversaw. At first, these were treated as delays, then as confusion. then his absence. Vanessa Hart stood in the corridor outside Ethan's study, watching servants move faster than they spoke. "He will find her," she said softly, though no one had asked. Maggie Collins passed her without stopping. "He already has," Maggie replied. Vanessa frowned. "Then where is she?" Maggie's voice carried no triumph, only truth. "Not where he is looking." Back on the northern ridge, Ethan had begun to walk, not back toward the palace, forward along the trail. Lucas followed at a distance, watching the way Ethan's certainty was beginning to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. Not in anger, not in panic, in recalculation, because Ethan Blackwood had never needed to search for someone who always returned. He stopped at a break in the trees where the snow had been disturbed lightly, then smoothed again by wind. "She would not leave without direction," Ethan said. Lucas answered carefully. "She left with direction, just not yours." That was the first time Ethan did not respond immediately. The words landed too cleanly, too accurately. He looked at the empty stretch of land ahead. For the first time, he did not say she would come back. Instead, he said something quieter. "Then where does she go when she stops belonging?" Lucas did not answer, because Clara Miller had already answered that question in a different language. She had said it in objects returned, in silence chosen, in a doorway that no longer held anyone waiting inside it. And somewhere beyond the reach of Blackwood's certainty, Clara continued walking forward into a world that no longer assumed she would turn around. The northern trail did not end at a wall. Clara had expected a wall, some visible line, some carved stone declaring the edge of Blackwood authority. Instead, the border arrived quietly, like most important things did. A break in the trees, a shift in the wind, a row of old iron markers half buried in snow. Beyond them, the road bent toward cross territory, where Ethan Blackwood's commands could still be heard if he shouted loudly enough, but no longer carried law unless someone chose to obey. Clara stopped before the markers and looked down at them. The snow had gathered around the iron like white cloth over old bones. She had seen these markers on maps for years. She had written supply routes around them. She had corrected treaty language about them. She had never stood before them as a person with the right to cross. The thought made her strangely still. Behind her, hoofbeats broke the morning. Not many. 2 horses. She knew one before she turned. Ethan had always ridden as if the road belonged to him. Lucas rode differently. With care. With apology. Clara did not move toward either. Ethan slowed several paces away, his horse restless beneath him. For a moment, he only looked at her. Her gray traveling gown. The small bag. The bare throat where the moonstone clasp had been. The absence of every Blackwood color he had ever placed on her and mistaken for devotion. "Clara," he said. The name sounded wrong in the open air. Too intimate for a man who had made certainty public and concern private. Clara faced him fully. "Your Majesty." Ethan flinched. Only slightly. But she saw it. So did Lucas. "Do not call me that. It is your title. Not to you." Clara's expression remained calm. That was never made official either. The sentence hit with quiet precision. Ethan dismounted. Lucas stayed back. Wisely. "You left without speaking to me." Clara looked toward the iron markers, then back at him. "You spoke enough for both of us." His jaw tightened. "You heard one conversation." "No," she said. "I heard 5 years inside one sentence." The wind moved between them. Ethan's horse lowered its head, uneasy. "I was angry," he said. No, Clara's voice was gentle, and somehow that made it worse. "You were comfortable." He had no answer for that. Not immediately. Comfort was harder to defend than anger. Anger could be excused. Comfort revealed architecture. Ethan stepped closer. "Come back. We will discuss this properly." Clara almost smiled. Not from amusement. From the old reflex of trying to soften a hard truth before handing it over. She stopped herself. "Properly means inside your walls, under your title, after I have already returned. It means face to face. We are face to face." He stopped. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to notice that the conversation was already happening and still not obeying him. "Clara," he said again, lower now. "I made a mistake." "No," she answered. "You made a belief visible." Ethan's face shifted. The words reached him because they were not shouted. He looked at her small bag, then at the snow around her boots. "You cannot simply walk into cross land alone." "I can. It is dangerous." "So was staying where I was assumed." Lucas lowered his eyes. Ethan did not. His pride was wounded. but something beneath it was beginning to bleed. You were never supposed to leave. Clara looked at him then, really looked. At the man who had once touched a moonstone clasp at her throat like it meant protection. At the king who had built a life around her labor and called it loyalty. At the alpha who had said she would never leave because she always stayed. That was your mistake, she said. Not my promise. Silence followed. This time, it belonged to her. Ethan reached out, not fully touching, but close enough for the old world to try to return. Lucas took one step forward, alarmed. Clara did not step back. She only looked at Ethan's hand until he understood and lowered it. You lost the right to reach for me before you noticed I was gone, she said. His hand fell to his side. Beyond the iron markers, a dark horse emerged from the white trees. Its rider wore no crown, only a black winter coat and a silver border pin. Alpha Adrian Cross stopped on his side of the line, gaze moving from Clara to Ethan with careful restraint. Sanctuary is open, Adrian said. No claim, no debt, no condition. Ethan's eyes hardened instantly. This is not your matter. Adrian did not look away. It became mine when she reached the border. Clara turned toward the markers. The choice was suddenly visible. Not easy, not painless. Visible. Ethan's voice changed behind her. Not command now. Fear trying to disguise itself as reason. Clara, wait. She paused with one foot beside the first iron marker. I waited for years. Then she crossed. No thunder answered. No dramatic cracks split the sky. The world did not perform her freedom for anyone. Snow only softened beneath her boots on the other side. Adrian inclined his head and moved back, giving her space instead of direction. That mattered. Clara kept walking until she stood fully beyond Blackwood law. Then she turned once. Ethan remained on his side of the border, still holding the absence of her like a thing he did not know how to carry. You said I would never leave, Clara said. Her voice was quiet enough that he had to listen. So I stopped being the woman who made you right. Ethan did not speak. Maybe he could not. Lucas stood behind him with grief in his eyes and nothing useful left to offer. Clara turned toward the crossroad. This time, when she walked away, she did not hear hoofbeats follow. Only wind. Only snow. Only the first honest silence she had owned in years. Clara Miller did not stop when silence finally became louder than pursuit. She only stopped once, long after the laundry gate, long after Blackwood territory had disappeared behind frost and distance, when the northern wind no longer carried any trace of the palace that had once defined her life by assumption rather than choice. Ahead of her, the crossroad stretched into a pale horizon. Behind her, Ethan Blackwood was still learning how to interpret absence. But Clara did not look back again. The world she entered was colder in structure, not emotion. Cross territory did not feel softer than Blackwood. It simply did not pretend to belong to her. That difference mattered more than comfort. She walked for hours without interruption. Snow thickened along the roadside, brushing her boots with each step. The bag at her side grew heavier not because of weight, but because of awareness. Every object inside it was something she had chosen deliberately. Nothing given, nothing assumed, nothing returned in expectation of recognition. When the forest thinned, the cross-border village appeared in fragments. Wooden structures, lantern posts, and a quiet watchtower that did not raise alarm at her arrival. No one ran to announce her. No one blocked her path. Clara understood then that Ethan's world had always been shaped by reaction. This one was not. At the edge of the settlement stood a small administrative post. A man in a dark coat observed her approach without urgency. His gaze was not possessive, not surprised, simply aware. You crossed alone, he said. Clara nodded once. That is allowed, he replied after a pause, as if confirming a rule rather than granting permission. She felt something loosen inside her chest. Not relief. Recognition. No one here needed her to justify existing outside expectation. The man gestured toward the road beyond the post. Sanctuary line continues east. You may register there if you choose stability. If I choose, Clara repeated quietly. A faint, almost imperceptible nod. The concept itself felt foreign in a way that made her pause longer than exhaustion did. Choice without prediction. Action without ownership. She continued forward. By midday, the road widened into a neutral zone marked by old stone posts bearing no crest. Here, neither Blackwood authority nor cross-governance claimed emotional ownership of those who passed. It was not freedom declared. It was freedom unclaimed. Clara stopped at one of the stones. For the first time since leaving, she set her bag down. The sound it made against the ground was small, but final in a way no palace door had ever been. She opened it. Inside, the comb, the coins, the ring from her mother, the dried lavender Maggie had given her, and the empty space where obligation used to be stored. She closed it again without rearranging anything. Behind her, the wind shifted. Not footsteps, not pursuit, just air moving through an empty structure of distance. In Blackwood Palace, Ethan Blackwood had just begun to ride beyond certainty. In Cross territory, Lucas Reed had just begun to understand what could not be repaired by explanation. But here, in the neutral snow where no name was required, Clara Miller finally stood in a place that did not interpret her existence as belonging to anyone else. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time, no one turned her silence into expectation. Blackwood Palace did not collapse after Clara Miller left. That would have been simpler. Collapse was dramatic, visible, merciful in its honesty. What happened instead was slower, more humiliating. The palace continued standing while revealing, room by room, how much of its order had been borrowed from a woman no one had officially named. By the time Ethan Blackwood returned from the northern border, the morning had hardened into a bright, cold day. The outer gates opened for him without ceremony. No horns, no formal announcement. The guards bowed, but not deeply enough to hide the question in their eyes. Did you bring her back? He had not. That answer rode in with him before he dismounted. Lucas Reed followed several paces behind, silent as stone, his expression carrying the restraint of a man who knew grief was not always innocent. Ethan handed his reins to a stable boy and walked toward the main hall. Every step into the palace made Clara's absence more precise. The first messenger stopped him near the west corridor. Alpha King, the Eastern Grain delegation, is waiting. Lady Clara usually reviewed the winter allotment figures before. The messenger froze. Ethan looked at him. Before what? The man swallowed. Before anyone presented them to council. Ethan said nothing. The messenger lowered his gaze and stepped aside. The second interruption came before Ethan reached the council chamber. A young healer approached with 2 folded notes and shaking hands. The Grey Wolf Rowan still refuses medicine. The mixture in the ledger is incomplete without Lady Clara's dosage mark. Ethan's jaw tightened. Use the royal healer. We did. The girl's voice dropped. Rowan bit through the bowl. Lucas closed his eyes for 1 second. Ethan kept walking. Not because he did not hear. Because hearing had become dangerous. Inside the council chamber, elders spoke over one another around a table covered with reports Clara would have already sorted by urgency, region, and consequence. Without her system, everything looked louder and less useful. Vanessa Hart sat near the hearth in a pale green dress, beautiful and still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. No one asked her for direction. That should have pleased her. It did not. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table. The chair to his right remained empty. Clara's chair. Not officially. Never officially. But everyone looked at it before they looked at him. That was the first insult. The second was that Ethan looked too. Begin, he said. Elder Grant opened a file. The Northern Border Report is missing its final risk assessment. Clara left it outside my study, Ethan said. Silence fell. Not because the answer helped. Because every person in the room understood what else she had left there. The moonstone clasp. The key. The certainty he had worn like armor. Lucas placed the folded crisis report on the table. She completed the assessment before leaving. An elder murmured, "Of course she did." Ethan's eyes lifted. The elder went pale. I know what you meant," Ethan said. And he did. That was worse. The council continued, but badly. They asked questions Clara would have answered before they formed. They contradicted notes she had already corrected. They discovered 3 appointments she had shielded Ethan from because they were beneath royal attention but above neglect. Beneath royal attention. Ethan heard the phrase in his own mind and hated it because it sounded exactly like the palace that had produced him. Halfway through the meeting, a servant entered carrying the advisory seal Clara had returned. She placed it before Ethan with both hands. This was found in Lady Clara's room, Your Majesty. Lady Clara, not Miss Miller, not the woman who helps, not the one who always stays. Lady Clara. The title arrived after she was gone, like most dignity Blackwood Palace had given too late. Ethan touched the edge of the seal. Cold metal. returned authority, and used recognition. Was this ever registered? He asked. No one answered quickly enough. Margaret Shaw, the eldest councilwoman, finally spoke from the far end of the room. No, Ethan looked at her. Why? Margaret's expression did not soften. Because registering her would have required admitting how much she did. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Lucas looked at the empty chair. Ethan stared at the seal until the engraved crest blurred into something almost meaningless. For years, Clara had sat beside power without being given any. She had carried decisions without title, consequence without authority, responsibility without protection. And he had called that loyalty because the word cost him nothing. Register it, Ethan said. The chamber shifted. Margaret leaned forward. In what name? Ethan's throat moved once. Clara Miller. With what designation? That question struck harder. Because the honest answer was not Luna. Not advisor. Not servant. Not guest. Not almost. Blackwood had built an entire place for her out of useful ambiguity. Ethan looked at the empty chair again. Royal Strategic Advisor, he said, voice low. Retroactive. With full compensation record. A few elders exchanged glances. One opened his mouth. Rowan's distant warning growl rolled up from the courtyard before he could speak. No one laughed. No one objected. Ethan stood. And removed that chair. Lucas looked up sharply. Ethan. Not from memory, Ethan said. From misuse. He turned toward the servants standing by the wall, the healers near the door, the council members suddenly very still. No one sits beside this throne without name, rank, consent, and the right to leave. The words did not repair anything. Ethan knew that. Clara was not in the room to hear them. That made them both cleaner and more painful. He dismissed the council before noon. Not because business was finished. Because the palace had finally begun telling the truth, and truth required witnesses who had not benefited from avoiding it. Alone afterward, Ethan returned to the empty chair. On the table, the moonstone clasp lay beside Clara's advisory seal. Gift and labor. Affection and use. The two things he had confused until she separated them for him. He picked up a blank page. For one foolish moment, he thought of writing to her. Then he remembered her line. I will not be where I am assumed. So he did not write come back. He did not write forgive me. He wrote only what he had no right to send yet. I am learning the shape of what I failed to name. Then he folded the page and placed it under the seal, unsent, while beyond the palace walls the northern road remained empty and Clara Miller continued living without waiting for his realization to become her burden. Clara Miller did not realize how far she had walked until the world behind her stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a memory that no longer had authority over her. The neutral snow had ended hours ago. Now the terrain was softer, darker, shaped by hills that bent the wind rather than resisted it. Cross territory did not announce itself with borders or banners. It simply continued existing, indifferent to whether someone had once belonged elsewhere. She adjusted her bag once more and kept walking. By midday, she reached a river crossing marked by old stone pylons. A small cross patrol post stood nearby, smoke rising from a narrow chimney. No one stopped her. No one questioned her direction. One guard only watched her approach, then turned and opened the gate without speaking. That silence felt unlike Blackwood silence. Blackwood silence had always been expectation held in reserve. This silence was absence of ownership. Name? The guard finally asked as she passed. Clara hesitated for the first time since leaving. Not because she did not know the answer. Because she was no longer required to use the old one. Clara, she said simply. No titles followed. No explanations. The guard nodded once, as if that was sufficient to categorize her existence, then returned to his post. She crossed the wooden bridge alone. The river below moved fast, breaking thin ice into drifting fragments. Clara watched them without thinking of Ethan Blackwood for the first time in a way that did not feel like resistance. It simply did not occur. On the far side, a narrow road led toward a settlement carved into the valley. Smoke rose in thin threads from stone chimneys. People moved without urgency, without performance. Life here did not wait to be observed by a throne. A woman at the edge of the road noticed her and slowed. Not alarmed. Curious. You're from the north? She asked. Clara considered again. Yes, she said. The woman looked her over once, travel-worn, quiet, not marked by insignia or escort. Then she gestured lightly down the road. You can stay in the lower house until you register, she said. No one asks questions the first night. That sentence carried a strange weight. No questions. Clara nodded. As she followed the road into the settlement, she noticed something she had not experienced in years. No one was tracking her usefulness. No one was measuring her return. No one was waiting for her to fix anything. The lower house was simple. Wood, stone, warmth that came from function rather than decoration. A woman handed her a small lantern and a blanket without asking why she had come alone. Room 3, she said. Door locks if you need it to. Clara paused at the doorway. Locks had always meant containment in Blackwood. Here, it meant choice. That distinction settled somewhere deep in her chest. Inside the room, there was a narrow bed, a table, and a window facing the river she had crossed. She set her bag down carefully, then stood still for a long moment. No urgency pulled at her. No expectation called her name. For the first time since leaving, silence did not feel like aftermath. It felt like space. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her bag. Everything inside remained exactly as she had packed it. Small, deliberate, sufficient. Nothing added. Nothing missing. No trace of a life that demanded explanation. Outside, the settlement continued without noticing her arrival as an event. Back in Blackwood, Ethan Blackwood was still learning that certainty does not bring people back. It only delays the moment you understand they are already gone. But here, in the valley beyond ownership, Clara Miller finally allowed herself to understand something else. She was not returning. She was beginning. Clara Miller stayed in room 3 for 3 nights before anyone in cross territory asked if she wanted her name written down. Not required. Not demanded. Wanted. The clerk who came to the lower house was an older woman with silver hair, a wool coat, and ink-stained fingers. She placed one blank form on the table and sat across from Clara without touching it. Sanctuary registry, she said. Only if you choose protection under cross law. Clara looked at the paper. There were no chains in it. No hidden clauses. No language that transformed shelter into ownership. If I do not sign? The clerk's answer came easily. You may still sleep here tonight. Something in Clara's chest loosened so quietly it almost felt like grief. And after that, you decide. Clara lowered her eyes to the blank line where her full name belonged. For years, Blackwood Palace had used her name only when it needed her hands. Clara for the wolves. Clara for the treaty. Clara for the crisis. Clara for the king. Never Clara for herself. She picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. Clara Miller. No title followed. No borrowed crest. No Blackwood mark. The clerk waited until the ink dried before speaking again. Do you want notice sent to Blackwood that you are under voluntary sanctuary? Clara looked toward the window. Beyond it, the river moved beneath thin ice, breaking and continuing. Voluntary, she repeated. That word must be included. It will be. And no request for audience will be accepted without my consent. The clerk wrote it down. Also included. Clara nodded. Then send it. The notice reached Blackwood Palace 2 days later, carried in a sealed cross envelope that did not bow to Ethan Blackwood's grief. He read it in the council chamber, standing beside the empty space where Clara's chair had been removed. Lucas watched him. Margaret Shaw watched too. No one spoke until Ethan lowered the page. Voluntary sanctuary. No claim. No transfer. No audience without consent. The words were legal. Clean. Cruel only because they were fair. She is safe, Lucas said. Ethan folded the notice carefully. Yes. That is something. Ethan looked at the empty space beside the table. It is not mine to call something. That was the first honest sentence he had spoken without needing Clara present to make it true. The reforms continued after that. Not loudly. Not as a performance sent north to impress a woman who had left. The advisory registry was opened. Every servant whose labor entered council record received a name beside it. The royal healers were required to document who prepared medicine and who administered it. Council seats could no longer be occupied unofficially for more than 30 days. No one could be asked to carry royal responsibility without rank, wage, consent, and exit terms. Ethan signed every measure. None of them brought Clara back. That was the point he forced himself not to hate. Weeks passed, then months. Winter released the roads slowly, reluctantly, as if even the land needed time to accept that some departures were not pauses. Clara remained in cross territory. She took work at the Valley Registry, not because she needed to become useful again, but because names mattered to her now. She learned how to read contracts that did not disguise ownership as care. She taught 2 young clerks how to question soft language. She laughed once in spring when a child spilled ink across 3 official forms and called it accidental law. The sound surprised her, not because she had forgotten how to laugh, because no one looked relieved when she did. In Blackwood, Ethan heard pieces of her life through formal channels only. Clara Miller registered as resident. Clara Miller refused audience. Clara Miller requested copies of old advisory records. Clara Miller returned 1 sealed box of Blackwood property discovered among her belongings, a silk scarf, 2 court pins, and an unopened winter invitation. He signed the receipt and did not send a reply. On the first anniversary of the night he had said she would never leave, Ethan walked alone to the royal study. The doorway stood open, empty. He did not close it. On the small table outside, there was no report waiting, no moonstone clasp, no woman listening in silence to learn how little she had been valued. He stood there until the fire inside burned low. "You were right to go," he said to the empty doorway. The doorway did not forgive him. It did not condemn him either. It simply remained what it was. Proof. Far north, Clara stood by the Cross River with her coat open to the warmer wind. Maggie had come to visit, carrying dried lavender, gossip, and a letter she did not pressure Clara to read. Clara accepted the lavender. She left the letter sealed. "Do you ever miss him?" Maggie asked softly. Clara looked across the water. The answer took time, not because it was unclear, but because honesty deserved precision. "I miss who I was when I still believed staying could make someone choose me." Maggie's eyes filled. Clara reached for her hand. "But I do not miss the waiting." The river broke another sheet of thin ice and carried it away. Clara watched it go. No thunder, no dramatic ending, only movement, only release. Behind her, the valley bells rang for evening meal. Ahead of her, the road curved toward a place she had not yet seen. For the first time in years, no one had decided whether she would take it. Clara smiled then, not to soften pain, not to survive insult, not because anyone was watching. She smiled because the doorway behind her was empty, and so was the road ahead, and this time emptiness did not mean loss. It meant room.